Good morning and welcome to the next in line of episodes with myself, Nathan Lomax from Quickfire Digital, and Mark Williams Cook from Candor. Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Hi, Nathan. Good. Thank you. Thanks for having me back yet again.
No problem at all. Becoming quite the habit. Now, this morning we're going to be talking in part 5 of the series around page speed and experience. And this is something we are often messaged about or asked about. And I thought, well, why not just address it head on and tackle some of those topics that come up? So, usual format for those that are joining us in the audience, please do ask your questions as you go. We will get through as many as we possibly can in the 45 minutes to an hour that we've got together this morning. Now, I'm going to start, Mark, with page speed. It's one of the most talked about aspects of websites, and every quote or proposal we get in, one of the main things on the brief is always, what can you guarantee about page speed and why is it so important? So let's start with that very question. Why is page speed so important?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's interesting because I'm going to be really picky here. I think some people say page speed and they mean performance, and some people mean performance and they mean page speed. And both, people use terminology for different things, but they're not the same. So if we're going to talk about page speed, we'll end up talking about core web vitals and stuff, and that's all about performance. So page speed is looking at how long it takes a web page to load, and it's not even that simple because again, when we talk about core web vitals, we're actually going to talk about perceived speed, which is when the user kind of feels things are loaded and when they're satisfied versus when the whole page is finished loading. So you can already see we scratched the surface, and it's like, oh, it's not quite as simple as how long does it take to for this page to load. The reason I think it's so important is it's a universal shared experience or a universal shared pain. Everyone understands what page speed is as a concept or performance is as a concept. Everyone's had that experience where they've a website's had the audacity to make them wait more than 1 second for something to load, and they click off and go somewhere else. And it's something that's constantly evolving. Expectations are constantly increasing in terms of page speeds. I remember trying to use like WAP internet on a Nokia, and I was like majorly impressed that pages were loading in like 20 seconds and it was just like text. And now, I'm annoyed if a whole ecom site doesn't load pretty much instantly. From the business point of view, though, it dramatically impacts your bottom line. So there's a really great website if people haven't seen it, which is called wpostats.com, and it's web performance optimization stats, and they just give very short snippets of real life case studies of when companies have improved performance and the impact it's had. So I pulled off a couple here because I put some actually like you in a proposal a few days ago. So Vodafone increased their page speed by 30%, and that sounds a lot, but it's probably in fact only a second or two. And this gave them a 15% increase in their lead rate and an 8% increase in sales. Bridesmaid dress retailer Revelry launched its e-commerce site on an updated version of its e-com platform with just smaller images. Site loaded 43% faster, and their conversion was up 30%. And fashion retailer Misguided, who probably a lot of us know, removed something called Bazaar Voice, which is like a kind of a plugin that pulls together user-generated content, took that off, and it improved their page load time by 4 seconds. That increased their revenue by 26%. So imagine increasing your revenue by 25% by doing one thing. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And I've had clients in the past where I've asked them, I've said, okay, I think we can increase your, or decrease your page load time from, it was pretty bad, it's like 8 seconds. And I said to about 5. And this is going to cost about $3,000. And they were like, no, thank you. That's really expensive. And I was like going away and I was like, why aren't they doing this? And I came back to them and I was like, I think I can add about 30 grand onto your business per year and it'll cost $3,000. And they were like, well, yeah, of course. And it's like, okay, well, these are the same thing. I'd obviously explained it badly, but
Yeah.
that's why it's so important, I think, to users and businesses.
And let's just build on that because many clients, whether you be on a WordPress or a Shopify or any of those platforms out there, will go along the line of adding apps for extra functionality and everything else, but they're trying to have their cake and eat it, right? They want all the functionality. So, great example with Misguided. They've added this bizarre voice for Android visitors because they think it's going to help the user experience and everything else. But actually, it's helped over here, but it's a bit like a game of whack-a-mole. It's now caused a problem over here. What is your recommendations to people when it comes to adding lots of functionality? Is it always just get a business case? The amount of people I talk to that have gone, oh, well, I was down the pub last night and someone mentioned that they use this app. Can we try it? And you're like, yes, but have you thought of the implications it might have to other metrics that you're trying to satisfy?
Yeah, so it's all functionality does come with some kind of cost, whether it's user experience complexity or like we're talking about performance now. And I think this is the pros and cons of various platforms. So Shopify, is one of the leading ecom platforms for a reason. It's really quick to get set up. If you start going to the extreme other end, though, which is you need lots of tied in functionality with any system where you're using extensions, add-on plugins, it can be difficult because they all operate in their own kind of silo. So, you've got 3 plugins and they all work separately. You can have 2 and 3 or 1 and 3 or just 2. If you really want lots of complicated functionality, then sometimes it's normally a big step up in budget, but that's when you start looking at bespoke builds to tie these things together. Otherwise, like with any platform, any system you're on, you do have to make a decision. And my advice would be, listen to your developers and test things before you put them live. You can test how it's going to impact your performance before you put it live. And then, do a test on your revenue, on your bottom line. So if, like Misguided saying, well, what, apart from the bottom line impact it's having, how is, say, Bizarre Voice helping our marketing, and is it driving new traffic to us? Does that outweigh long term the extra conversion we've got? So it's a really difficult, complicated question, but yeah, I've experienced that as well, which is you certainly shouldn't just be like, oh yeah, we want our site to do this, whack this on, because you will
Yeah.
get yourself into debt.
I mean, I like the idea of a bit of an app audit where you just essentially have your apps and you say, okay, we need to look at page speed as a metric as a whole. Let's go through our apps. Which one is absolutely critical and we can't live without? Which one could we try living without? Well, let's disable it for a week. Let's have a look at impact and revenue. Good God, it's gone through the roof, or actually very little difference. Therefore, let's turn it back on. Let's try it with something else. Again, something that many retailers should look at because these marginal gains are which make all the difference, right? They soon compound, and before you know it, you've gone from a 2% conversion to a 4% conversion or whatever. That could be a massive impact to the bottom line. So, certainly one to pick up. Now, building on the topic we've just discussed, as you know and would have seen, the web has been awash with chat around core web vitals, right? And every man and his dog wants to know about core web vitals. Just for those that perhaps are new to the concept, and if you are new to it, I'd ask where have you been the last however long, but perhaps you haven't heard of it. Let's just give a quick overview of what core web vitals is, and then we'll dig in a bit more detail.
Sure. So core web vitals are 3 metrics that Google has put forward to measure user experience. Okay. The 3 metrics are LCP, which stands for largest contentful paint. That's a speed metric, like a page speed metric. And it's an indicator of what I mentioned earlier, which is perceived load speed. So it's basically when most of the page is loaded for the user. And they give us like a traffic light system for if it's good, if it needs improvement, or if it's bad. The second metric is FID, which is first input delay. And basically it just measures interactivity. So it's the delay in milliseconds before a site becomes interactive. And again, we've got this traffic light system of if it's less than 100 milliseconds, that's great. If it's more than 300 milliseconds, it's bad, it needs improvement. And lastly, there's one called cumulative layout shift. These all have really kind of complicated sounding names, but they're all things you'll be familiar with. So cumulative layout shift measures when a page loads, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, when things jump around as it's loading. So the big culprits of this are always like the see what this celebrity looks like now, slideshow type thing, and then you go to click next, and then it jumps down and you've clicked on an ad, that kind of thing. So Google don't want your page to jump around. Now, what's special about these 3 metrics is that they can be applied to any website. There's no kind of special case where, oh, in this situation, it doesn't matter if CLS is high or if perceived page speed is high. And that's a really difficult thing to do when you think about it. If you try and think of any other metric to measure user experience that can be applied to any type of website, whether it's ecom or Wikipedia, that's a very hard thing to do. So they're very interesting metrics in that point of view. And yeah, you've got, Google gives you 2 different ways to measure them as well, which I think we won't get into that right now, but there are tools out there that you can literally measure them on any site. Because the other difficult thing about kind of web performance stuff is actually what tools you use to go about measuring it. And again, in the past, we've had clients saying, well, we've run this report from this tool and it says it's good, and then this one says it's bad. And they're all measuring in slightly different ways. And they're measuring maybe from different places in the world as well, which all has its impact. So yeah, Core Web Vitals, very special because it covers not just page speed, it covers the whole kind of bag of performance, and they can be applied anywhere.
So, Mark, it'd be amiss of me not to ask, what tools are you guys recommending when talking to clients around where to begin when testing Core Web Vitals, whether that be on their own store or competitors' stores, or perhaps on a new store?
Sure. So when it comes to Core Web Vitals, there's 2 ways to measure it. You can use what's called lab data or field data. Now, you'll only have in your Google Search Console account, you'll have access to what's called your field data, and this is data coming from real people's browsers. Okay, and why this is important is it's reflective of how your actual visitors are experiencing the site, because there's no objective, your site has scored this, for instance, on largest contentful paint on page speed, because if you run a test from the UK on a fiber connection, you might score really well. But if all of your customers are, somewhere else in the world and the internet speed is a lot slower and they run the test, you're going to score badly. And of course, you need to build your website for your audience. So it's no good doing kind of your test locally and then looking at the field data and being like, oh, actually, most of our customers are in this country and the web's slow, so the website's bad. So I would always start by looking at the field data, because that's your actual data from your real users. And again, you can really get into the long grass and decide, okay, well, we might actually have 2 different versions of our website. One maybe for people in the UK or, in Western Europe, and one for where, our users are connecting from, where the internet's slower, perhaps. And that's going to improve your scores, but actually improve the experience of the user. The lab tests are ones that you can run anywhere at any time. So this most simple one to use is Google has what's called a Page Speed Insights tool. That will give you your Core Web Vital metrics. So you can just Google Page Speed Insights. Things to be aware of is, as I've said, it matters where it's run from, that test. And also, if you just run it twice in a row, you may get slightly different results. So nothing is kind of living in a vacuum and
Why is
static
that,
on the
Mark?
web.
Why is it that you get 2 different results when you run one like now and one in 5 minutes time?
Because you're, depending how your site's set up, even if you're sitting on your own server, it's not always going to respond. It's going to respond as quickly as it can, but there might be network traffic between where you're doing the test from and there. The site may be busier. The internet isn't just kind of waiting blank for you to kind of do something. There's lots of traffic being routed around, and lots of systems doing fallbacks and trying to get everything as quick as you can. But it will be slightly different every single time. You wouldn't expect major differences unless, again, you've got maybe some kind of issue with the server. But if you're doing those lab tests as like an agency, or if you've got developers in house, what you would actually do is you would set them up to run automatically a few times a day, because then you get a fair average of what's going on. If you haven't got the ability to do that with kind of a development team, there's tools like I mentioned before on this show, like Little Warden, and Little Warden will actually monitor your site and do Core Web Vitals tests for you, lab tests, and it will send you email alerts on if you change threshold. So we mentioned there's that green, amber, red kind of threshold system that Google scores us by. So if your site on average moves from a green to a yellow, or hopefully from a yellow to a green, it will send you email alerts. So that's a really good platform if you don't have kind of devs at your beck and call to set up that kind of monitoring. Because the only problem with the field data is while it's reflective of the user experience, there's like a month lag on that data.
So, Mike, let's say we carry out a Core Web Vitals report and we're like, okay, now we need to dive in and fix pages. When you're putting in the URL into the Google PageSpeed tools or Insights, do you just put in the home page and it does the whole site? Do you need to put in each individual page? How does it work?
Yeah, so the page you put in is just going to test that page. Now, in terms of performance of a website, normally you can break that down by template, meaning the homepage is normally unique. If it's an e-commerce site, you've most likely got categories, maybe subcategories, and product pages. So at minimum, I would test a few variations of each template of page, because if there are systemic issues that you can fix, so they're the ones that are going to have the biggest impact. So if you fix an issue on a template, it will be present then on all versions of that template. So you've made quite a lot of gain. That's how you're just going to discover it. Of course, there might be outliers where someone has uploaded like a 10 megabyte picture on a single product or something, and that can be picked up through more automated monitoring. But if you're running these on the spot tests, you need to identify what the different templates are and do a range of tests on those. In terms of the field data you've got as well from Google Search Console, it's super smart because it tries to group that performance by template as well. So Google's obviously reading your code and looking at your site, and it's saying, hey, these 200 pages are very similar, and we found this issue across what we think is a template. So actually the tools are pretty good in terms of field data to try and help you with that. I keep talking about field data. I'll give a caveat though as well. You need to have a fair amount of traffic to your site before you get that field data. So if your site's new and you've only got 100 visitors or a few thousand visitors a month, you might not have any field data because Google doesn't have enough kind of averages to give you good numbers. So it might be blank. So you have to do lab tests.
Mark, question just in. Would you start with homepage, product page, category page, or another?
I'd probably start with the templates where I'm getting the most traffic. So I would guess that's going to be category pages in most cases. But I would, in terms of what would I fix first, there isn't a high cost to actually running the tests in terms of time or anything. So I'd test them all. But then in terms of what would I fix first, it would be where the greatest impact would be for the lowest cost. So anything really you do in terms of a site like that, you're trying to make a business case for why you're going to make a change. And that normally starts with kind of how you mentioned with the plugin audit. You would do an audit of your templates, and then you would have a little look and identify if you are scoring badly, try and see if you can work out why you're scoring badly, and then what you think the impact will be if you fix those things and how difficult they are to fix. Because it's all well and good if you think, okay, this thing, if we fix it, will have a really big impact, but we have to rewrite half the site to do it. It may not be worth it. It may be doing something that will have a smaller impact that's like one line of code and a template you have to change.
Mark, where do you sit in terms of if someone's had a site built in the last 6 months and they listen this morning and they go and run the test and it's not scoring as they'd hoped? Where do you sit in terms of, well, is that their problem? Is it the developer's problem? Like that surely is a real grey area, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I mean, firstly, I'd say don't worry if your site's kind of not all green. So the majority of sites I look at are kind of amber and red. That's really, really common. The other thing I would say is that as I said, technology and expectations change. So even if a site was built 6 months ago, it's very hard for a developer to say, oh well, it's going to score like this on Core Web Vitals, because as I said as well, it depends on the connection speed and technology of the person that's actually doing the test and the people that are using the site. So it might score really well for the developers, but not for the actual end users. And the actual technology of how we can optimize sites is always changing. Several years ago, we didn't have all the services like Cloudflare now offering various types of caching and CDNs. There wasn't native support in HTML for lazy loading images. So a lot of this stuff didn't exist. So especially if your site's a few years old, the way I would recommend all businesses view their website is that it's never finished. So the environment which your website is living in is constantly changing. That's constantly evolving. So you should be thinking of your site in the same way. So how can we keep our site up to date and meeting expectations, meeting these technological changes? Not let's build a site and then don't touch it for 5 years, and then in 5 years everyone agrees it's rubbish, and then start from scratch and build another one. You should be looking at this
Yeah, that iterative
continual
process.
improvement. Yeah.
Definitely. Now, in terms of, you mentioned there about caching, you mentioned there about lazy load. There are obviously a couple that almost apply to every site, right? And normally, when you go and do an audit, you can almost guarantee that those two will be relevant in terms of improving performance. Are there any others, kind of low hanging fruit, that almost without looking at an audit? These are the typical things we see: scripts not being minified, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, because when it comes to improving these scores, I think a lot of people underestimate how difficult this can be. So it might be like, okay, well, we just need to do caching, and then it gets into conversation of which kind of caching and which parts of the site. And then, as anyone that's been involved in development will know, caching can become very tricky, with people's cache like sticking or expiring. The amount of times I've heard there's an issue with this website, and then half an hour later I heard, oh, it's a caching issue, is too many times to count. And so common issues that always crop up, for instance, are things like JavaScript, like sites being really heavy with JavaScript libraries. And this is because there's lots of frameworks out there and CMSs that try and do lots of things and therefore come packaged with a lot of JavaScript. So they're quite heavy. And there's a process you can go through called tree shaking, which is essentially looking at which JavaScript, which files are actually used by pages, and then if they're not used, stopping them loading. But again, that's a very technical process that you don't want to get wrong and can cause issues. We mentioned lazy loading, so that sounds like that's really obvious to do, right? It's got native support. Lazy loading, for those that don't know, means that you don't load the images basically until the user's scrolling down to them, so it saves that initial load time. So you think, brilliant, we implement lazy loading, and what you're probably going to do then is make your cumulative layout shift score worse, because as you scroll with the page, it's going to kind of resize to load in images, because you forgot, apart from lazy loading, you also need to put placeholder images in, because that then keeps the page structure the same when you move it, so you're not ruining your cumulative layout shift score. So like you said, it's almost like sometimes whack-a-mole with these optimizations and trying to get everything to work. Yes, there's other basic things, like we mentioned before, if you are uploading products, making sure you're optimizing your images, or making sure your CMS optimize your images for you is a really basic one. We mentioned that in the web performance stats website as well, how they, I think it's like 41%, I think we said, faster just because they made their images smaller. But it's definitely something I would go to the developers about, and you need to get a price and make a business case for it. It can get quite technical, is the only thing I'd say. But this is, again, when I gave that first anecdote and I said, we made some changes and it was going to cost the client $3,000 because it was a lot of work, but it was worth that several times over in terms of revenue. So I think the most important thing business owners need to be aware of is the value of performance, which is very high and immediate.
Bang on. So, in terms of website speed, Mark, I mean, for years people have said it's a ranking factor. Is it a ranking factor? Is it not a ranking factor? Google Core Web Vitals suggests that maybe performance is a ranking factor, but speed itself, is it a ranking factor? Is it not? And how can we just get this myth sorted once and for all?
Yeah. So pre-Core Web Vitals, the answer was kind of like not really. Google specifically said, if there's two sites and one loads in 6 seconds and one loads in 3 seconds, there's basically going to be no difference there. Of course, if you had a site that's really slow, taking like 15 seconds to load, then yeah, you're going to get a problem. So they kind of used to have this fairly binary system, it seemed, of if something was really bad, then you got kind of a mark against your record, and you might find you're not ranking as well. Now they have a page experience algorithm that includes a whole bunch of things. So Core Web Vitals is one of them. Things like non-intrusive interstitials, so they don't want people whacking up massive, hard to close pop-ups over the content. And there's several things that go into that kind of algorithm of page experience. Yes, Web Core Vitals is one, and one part of Web Core Vitals is this perceived loading speed, this largest contentful paint. Now, when I talk to clients about this, I actually tend not to talk too much about SEO because, as we've just been saying, this this perceived loading speed has an impact on bottom line that's quite measurable and really important. So I treat the fact that, hey, we might rank better almost as a bonus, so it is a ranking factor. But again, if we think about just ranking, we only need to be better than our competitors, right? You don't need to run faster than a lion, you just need to run faster than the other person. That's pretty much what you can say in terms of that as a ranking thing, but it stands on its own in terms of the conversion rate and bottom line. So that's why I would focus heavily on it. And then you've got this argument about, well, it kind of passively affects things, or it affects things indirectly, because if people like your website, they're more likely to share it, link to it, do all the good stuff that you want people to do on a site. So yeah, performance is one area, especially if your competitors aren't, that you can stand out. It's one of the reasons why, even though lots of people complain about Amazon and tax and things like that, they still use it because it's so convenient and so fast.
Yeah. Mark, last question for today. Really keen to find out from yourself, what are the 3 practical things website owners should take from today regarding page speed and experience moving forwards?
Yeah. So the first is, if you haven't done it, or if you don't have one, make a Google Search Console account. So Google Search Console is your kind of diagnostic dashboard. It's your direct line to Google. It's free, and look at your field data. So this is the actual people. If you're seeing lots of red on there, then it is definitely worth a discussion with someone to work out what you can do. The simplest thing, and the thing that I still see, is what we mentioned about image size. So we still see loads of e-com sites uploading these whacking great images that aren't optimized. You can compress images losslessly really well nowadays. So the user can't see that there's any quality difference, but you can massively reduce file size. And these should be optimized for different devices as well. So you're not loading in whacking great images for mobile. And if you're not on one, looking at a CDN, so a content distribution network, something like Cloudflare or similar, can really, really help you. So that's going to make sure your assets are served as locally as possible to visitors. You can, especially with paid versions of Cloudflare, you can do some really good stuff with caching, which means that your all of your performance metrics should improve, in terms of, we're not having to query databases. Everything's just there and it's ready. And it's fairly easy to set up. So yeah, check Google Search Console. Really make sure, go back to basics. You got your image size game sorted. And if you're not on one, look at CDN services.
Mark, perfect. Thank you as ever. I hope everyone's enjoyed today's shorter format of the SEO for e-commerce series. For those, Mark, that want to find out a little bit more about yourself or to ask any further questions and maybe haven't managed to catch this today but are seeing it on record, where can they find out more about yourself and your agency?
Yeah, so you can find us just by Googling Candor Agency, or you're free to add me on LinkedIn, Mark Williams Cook. I'm always happy to answer sort of questions. And check out as well, we've got a podcast that runs weekly called Search with Candor, where I just kind of go through all these SEO PPC changes every week, like this kind of short format, 20, 30 minutes. It's just there to kind of make your job easier because there is a lot to keep up to date with.
Mark, as ever, massive thank you for your time. Thank you to all those that have joined us today. I hope you've enjoyed today's session and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again.
Cheers, Nath.